Well, hello, welcome. My name is Lord Hardthrasher, and you, my squishy little friend, are here either because the algorithm has worked its magic and drawn you in like a moth to a candle, or because you clicked on my carefully crafted thumbnail. Either way, you are most welcome. Please make yourself comfortable. Do not be afraid, fair traveller, of the fact that this is episode 6 in a series. You can start here quite safely. Whether you're an old Burma hand 6 episodes in and merrily knocking back the pink gins and mepicrin tablets as your skin turns yellow and your teeth fall out, or whether you're a fresh piece of pink meat off the boat standing confused on the dockside as a swarthy-looking man with a worrying grin offers to carry your belongings to his cousin's hotel, you are just fine starting in here. Not least because, holy of holies, we are finally going to cover an Allied victory in Burma. After 6 episodes of defeat, despair and bloody Noel Irwin, it's 1944 and 14th Army has finally got good. But it will not be plain sailing from here in. Over the next few episodes, we are going to look at the entire 16,000 square mile front, which exploded with fire and fury in February of 1944, and which would continue to burn for the next 10 months. We're going to look at the first action here today, known as the Admin Box, or the Battle of the Admin Box, or the Battle of Shin Swaya, and sometimes the Battle of Nanyokadok Pass. Before zooming out to the next episode, we will look at what the Japanese and British planning staffs were actually trying to do to one another before diving into what that meant on the ground. So hold on to your slouch hats, because we're going in. As 1943 gave way to 1944, the 700-mile-long front between India and Burma was crawling with men, material, plans, counterplans, scouts, and an awful lot of folks on both sides preparing for, well, to be honest, no one was exactly sure what. Having had a truly shit time in 1942 when they were thrown out of Burma, and then an even shitter time in 1943 when they were bloodily repulsed from trying to re-invade Burma, the subsequent 10 months had seen Eastern Army transformed into 14th Army by its brilliant new commander, Lieutenant General Willaim Slim, known universally as Uncle Bill. In 1943, the strategy ideas emerging from London were confused. On the one hand, they didn't want to give Slim anything at all if they could avoid it. There would be none of the superabundance which other Allied war machines on other fronts got. But on the other hand, they wanted an invasion of Burma immediately by sea. And to show how serious they were, they sent out Lord Louis Mountbatten to take over as Supreme Allied Commander Southeast Asia. Very grand. He was related to the king and he looked like a rock star. He'd done some invading before. At Dieppe, which went well. Anyway, what they didn't send, however, for this naval invasion was any boats. No boats at all. In fairness, the Royal Navy was a tiny bit busy preparing for what the German army had once referred to as a river crossing in Europe somewhere. This left Slim on the horns of a dilemma. In the north of his front, in the regions known as Assam and Manipur, he needed to try and protect the key Dimapur-Tidim road. This ran from the Brahmaputra railhead at Dimapur through the Naga Hills, down to Kohima, down still more to the plains of Imphal, and then climbed up the Shan Hills to Tidim and Tamu on the Burmese border. This road represented really the only means of jumping off into Burma proper, and the most likely axis for advance should the Japanese attack. And we'll cover exactly what Slim planned to do about that in the next episode. In the south, though, Slim thought that he might be able to get the show on the road with an attack on Burma proper through a region called the Arakan. He charged a guy called Lieutenant General Philip Christensen to take his 15th Corps, made up of 5th and 7th Indian Divisions, down the peninsula, capture the port of Akiap and use it as a jumping-off point for the naval invasion of Rangoon that was totally, 100%, definitely going to happen at the same time as D-Day in Normandy. 100%, for sure. According to Mountbatten and the Royal Navy, anyway. But even if it didn't, Slim figured that he could keep the Japanese busy, and indeed Whitehall and Washington, and give him enough time to consider how to do a proper invasion overland into Burma from India. On the face of it, the idea of attacking down the Arakan might raise some eyebrows. The Arakan was a hellhole, and it still is, filled with disease, venomous snakes, and split by the massive range of 2,000-foot-high hills called the Mayu Range, which effectively meant that any offensive force was automatically split in two. It was filled with deep rivers and dried-up tributaries called changs, which would flood at a moment's notice. It was covered in jungle so thick that troops could not support one another, and even in the cold season, temperatures didn't drop below 26 degrees C and 80% humidity. Slim's previous boss, Noel Irwin, probably the least competent commander of British forces anywhere in the Second World War, which is quite the claim, had tried to attack the Arakan between December of 1942 and April of 1943. Despite, and indeed contrary to Slim's advice, Irwin had decided that the direct approach was the best one. He tried to build a road to support his troops, massively slowing down their rate of advance, and declared that the Mayu range of hills was impassable because they were just too big. He then shoved 6 brigades into the peninsula, split by that hill range. They were stopped in the end by a single Japanese battalion, who called up their mates from central Burma, who then promptly swarmed over those impassable hills and cut the British to ribbons. Irwin had naturally blamed everybody else that he could for this disaster of his own making, before being bundled off to the exciting front of eastern Scotland. Slim had been given his job and there had been much rejoicing, but he had a hellishly hard time trying to extract the units intact. Eventually, Slim, with the aid of a chap called Cyril Lomax, had managed to get the forces back to a defensible line, able to catch their breath during the end of the monsoon. Unsurprisingly, though, the subsequent 10 months had seen the Japanese dig in heavily, occupying the key road over the Mayu Range from Butidong to Mongdor and fortifying it. So what in 1943 might have been a relatively quick job looked a hell of a lot more daunting in 1944. Indeed, the Japanese had built what had quickly been dubbed the Golden Fortress at the village of Razubil, and then also dug themselves into 2 tunnels that sat right in the middle of the road, creating effectively a network of interconnected fortresses with tunnels that connected them all in a way that only the Japanese could. So they both had more troops in that space and better defences than last time. This was not going to be easy. Slim, however, had a plan. Before Irwin the idiot had gone for the General Melchett style of frontal assault, Slim had recommended a multi-led, multi-pronged approach. He proposed using makeshift rivercraft to perform a series of hops down the coast, combined with putting an interdiction force inland down the Caladan River that could be supplied by air to cut off any movement of Japanese forces from central Burma. He would then use his boats and encourage his troops to move around and bypass Japanese strongpoints, cutting them off and sealing them in and allowing them to wither on the vine. It was a plan that might well work if the Dominion, United Kingdom and Empire forces, or Duke forces as I'll call them from here on in, could break the crust of Japanese defences along the Butidong-Mungdor road. They might just be able to take the peninsula. To help to make sure that this would happen, Slim called on 2 key elements within his army. The first was armour, in this case in the form of the 25th Dragoons, one of the most storied cavalry units in the British Army, and pre-war chock full of chaps called Rupert and Johnny and Harry. These days, in line with the massive reforms that Slim and others had pushed through in the Indian Army, it also contained large numbers of Sharma, Pandits and Mishras, as Indians increasingly took over as the officer class. Secret weapon number 2 was the Royal Engineers. Slim had instituted the unofficial motto of God helps he who helps himself to the 14th Army. As Washington and London were really only ever going to give the Burma front hand-me-downs from other fronts, and the material advantage that the Allies enjoyed basically everywhere else in the world didn't apply here, Slim needed his troops to have a very different attitude to their brothers in the Pacific or in Europe, or indeed actually even on the Soviet front, and the engineers were key to this. Pointing at a small goat track called the Nyutgudok Pass, also known by local troops as the Okidok Pass, at the beginning of December 1943, he asked them to make it ready to take tanks, like right fucking now. The RE unofficial motto, spanner, screwer, lever and bolt, when, Gov, not sure about this, mate, hell of a job, mate, hell of a job. They just about resisted putting a cheeky quote into 14th Army headquarters and telling them that they couldn't start until next Thursday, and instead got on with the job. In fact, they got the work done within about 6 weeks, so that by the middle of January, the track was a fair-weather road down which the wonderful men of the 25th Dragoons and their obsolete M3 tanks could trundle majestically from one side of the Mayu Range to the other. This meant, theoretically, that 15th Corps now had an armoured reserve capable of traversing the range and supporting attacks on both ends of the road. Hopefully this would make the job of breaking the Golden Fortress and the other defensive much easier. Slim's commanders planned basically to put pressure on either end of the road, draw in Japanese reserves and then rapidly swing their pressure to the other end by using this pass. As we said a minute ago, if this worked, then in theory the British could go on to capture the town of Akiab, and from there launch an amphibious operation to take Rangoon. Slim was not, however, a total moron. He also knew that anyone seriously suggesting the use of landing craft in 1944 to do anything other than D-Day in Europe or invade Japanese islands was probably smoking something. To that end, his other plan was, at some point in the near future, to try and launch a reinvasion of Burma overland. Given the vast size of the front and the 14 divisions that the Japanese had been building up, he wasn't exactly sure how or when he'd be able to do this. But fortunately, the Japanese were about to make things considerably simpler. In March 1943, a sudden Lieutenant General Mutaguchi Reina had been ordered to take over as commander of the Japanese 15th Army in Burma, reporting to Lieutenant General Kawabe Masakazu, the Burma area commander and owner of the finest moustache of the Japanese Imperial General Staff. A slight side note here. Somehow Slim had got hold of a picture of Kawabe and used to keep it in his office so that, and I quote here, "Whenever I needed cheering up, I looked at it and reassured myself that, whichever of us was the cleverer general, I was at any rate the better looking." Between Mutaguchi and Kawabe, they cooked up a plan that we will cover in a lot more detail next time, but which started with a diversionary attack in the south called Hargo or Operation Z, what we will refer to in the west generally these days as the Battle of the Admin Box. With British forces pushing hard down on the Arakan and the defences around Razabil, Kawabe ordered Major General Sakurai Tokotaro of 28th Army's 55th Division to launch an all-out offensive on his front. This had two goals, one of diverting British reserves away from the Assam-Manipur area and the other potentially of pushing on to seize Chittagong. At the very least, in the hornet's nest that was the Japanese High Command, this would offer Mutaguchi two opportunities to win. Firstly, if Sakurai, as he expected, failed, he would at least still distract the British. But if Sakurai won and was able to destroy 5th and 7th Divisions and drive on to Chittagong, then Mutaguchi could take the credit, and it'd still allow him to see the British being distracted to make his fight in the north easier. Either way, Mutaguchi came out of this smelling like cherry blossom. Sakurai was, it has to be said, a bit of an odd fish. He'd once entertained his staff by performing a geisha dance with lit cigarettes stuffed up his nose and into his ears before handing them out to bemused subordinates to finish off. He wore a string of ladies' pearls pilfered somewhere on campaign and claimed that they granted him protection from Lord Buddha. I guess what I'm trying to say is that his grasp on reality could be somewhat tangential at times. So it didn't come as a galloping shock to his superiors that he then claimed that he would actually only need 1 battalion of troops to wipe out both 5th and 7th Divisions. They smiled, nodded, and gave him the cream of the 28th Army anyway. Sakurai began his planning for the offensive by breaking one of the cardinal rules of military operations. He divided his forces into special task groups with cool names. This was a favoured Japanese tactic. They were forever labelling this or that group of troops as force or butai and bigging up specific commanders in the process. So the largest part of Sakurai's forces were led by one Colonel Tanahashi called Tanahashi Force. This was actually the same chap who'd led the battalion that had stopped Irwin in the Arakan 12 months before. He was supposed to take about 8,000 men, infiltrate through the right-hand flank of 7th Division, through what was actually a front held by 114th Brigade, and attack them from the rear. As he did so, a small group would break off, known as Kobo Force. They would cross the Mayu Range, close the Okudok Pass, and pin 5th Division in place. Meanwhile, the rest of Sakurai's forces would form Doi Force, hammering at the front of 7th Division's positions. Thus, the British would be surrounded, would panic, break up, and be destroyed piecemeal. Sakurai would then capture their transport held at the administrative area and around a village called Shinswaya, mop up 5th Division, and then advance to capture the city of Chittagong in time for tea and medals. It all sounds so easy on the staff map, doesn't it? The problem with this plan was, how can I put this? Yes, it was dogshit. It ignored some absolutely key fundamental points which doomed it from the start. Let me explain. Now, I've covered this before, and if you want to go in more detail, you can go back to my Arakan episode, but basically Slim had transformed 14th Army in the previous months. He'd taken the idea of morale as the core base of what he was going to do, and he took it incredibly seriously, inculcating a sense of justice and fairness into his troops. He compared the barbaric behaviour that they had all seen by the Japanese with the rule of law and relative freedoms offered by the British. He'd worked hard to include independence-minded Indian soldiers and officers into the army, facing up to the reality that the British Empire needed to be dismantled post-war. The reforms of the Indian Army, which had begun in the 1930s, were accelerated, and Indian officers now regularly led white troops into combat. For example, Indian troops were regularly used in white British units as replacements, and so on and so on and so on. The integration was becoming much, much greater. As he later put it, we were not fighting to impose any particular form of government on anybody. We were fighting the Japanese army because it was an instrument of evil. We were fighting for freedom, fairness, and the freedom of our children. And it was a message which really struck home. Indians were not unaware of things like the Nanking Massacre, and as the hordes of refugees had poured back into India after the British defeats in 1942, stories of unimaginable sadism and hideous cruelty meted out by Japanese troops had spread like wildfire through the countryside. Even at the height of Gandhi's Quit India campaign and the civil unrest that had followed, army recruitment had still skyrocketed, and over 200,000 ordinary Indians were signing up every month to serve. Those recruits now made the Indian Army the largest volunteer army that the world has ever seen. The tactics and training of the first Burma campaign and subsequent Arakan campaigns had failed badly. Slim had addressed these problems head-on by learning the lessons quickly and incorporating new tactics into universally understood and administered training. To bang the point home, he carefully stage-managed attacks on Japanese positions which were inevitably victorious, showing the troops that they could fight and win using the new ideas. Troops were encouraged to tell stories of their victories and to gather souvenirs. So a new recruit joining 14th Army would be sat in a foxhole with troops who were festooned with flags and rank badges and helmets and swords, and in one Gurkha unit's case, the heads of their Japanese enemy. And they would know that the Japanese could be beaten. These tactics had been pushed out through battle schools that everyone, not just frontline troops, were expected to attend and pass. So everyone from cooks to cleaners to telephone operators to engineers to generals themselves, including Slim and his senior commanders, attended and were taught the theory of how to dig in and fight with pistol, rifle, Bren, grenade and bayonet. This established a set of universally understood basic manoeuvres, irrespective of colour, class, rank, creed or caste. So soldiers in a fight, even very unexperienced ones miles behind front lines, could react fast and cohesively to emerging situations, and NCOs given orders to scratch units would be able to rely on the men around them to respond as expected quickly. In an army which contained British, Burmese, Chin, Naga, Indians, Nepalese, Ghanaians, Gambians, Nigerians and dozens of others besides, speaking hundreds of languages and from utterly different cultures, this shared level of understanding, this shared level of knowledge and training and trust was absolutely vital. By 1944, it had had a radical impact on morale and battlefield effectiveness. A wise friend of mine once said when he was without a partner for a while in his early 20s, God helps he who helps himself, by which he meant that it was sometimes necessary to take oneself in hand and accept the aid of the internet. Slim used the phrase slightly differently. The 14th Army knew it could never have the same support that other armies got. Partly this was a reflection of the myriad of priorities that the Allies had in 1944, and partly simply due to the fact that there were only so many troops that could be maintained in these far-flung fronts down the single road, I remind you, that they all relied on. But what they could do was innovate and improvise like hell, and it was an attitude which generated the most extraordinary levels of camaraderie. Roll theme tune. What? What do you mean I can't? Oh, for God's sake, not bloody copyright. Okay, fine. Look, imagine stirring music associated with a well-known 1980s TV programme which became a film in which they built stuff in a shed, all right? Bloody hell. Lacking asphalt, they laid 2 million bricks for roads made of clay from the surrounding hills. Lacking silk for parachutes, they invented something called the parajute, a parachute made from jute, which was produced locally in India. Lacking concrete for landing grounds, they made airstrips from hessian that they'd impregnated with bitumen, and if at a push, they could actually use that to make roads. In a country covered in rivers, they had no patrol craft, so they built rivercraft from the trees of the jungle and put guns on them. Lacking fresh food, they created more than 200 duck farms to provide fresh eggs, and then planted giant vegetable gardens along the sides of the roads to provide fresh greens and keep the troops healthy, and so on and on and on and on. Slim used the Army's official newspaper, Sayak, edited by the former editor of the Evening Standard, to communicate to his troops about what units were doing interesting things, and encouraged ingenuity and curiosity wherever he could, harnessing their natural independent spirits for the common good. And he made a point of talking to every unit that he could about what their operational objectives were, why he needed their help, and what he planned to do to the enemy. Uncle Bill was the commander who would absolutely send you off to die if he needed to, but you'd know why, and you'd know that everyone else was relying on you to do your job as well as you could. It was a strong message, but it probably wasn't quite as strong as the feeling that the troops got when they saw the 25th Dragoons roll past with several hundred tons of angry shiny new tank replete with fucking great big guns ready to ruin Tojo's day. Taken together, this was a radical sea change. Throughout the war, Japanese intelligence was absolutely shite. With very few exceptions, it got everything about Duke troops wrong, from troop strengths to supply base locations to probable British intentions, and it managed to publish those up to a very senior level on a regular basis. But for the British, the story was quite different. Things like the Wireless Experimental Centre in Delhi, which was actually an outreach of Bletchley Park, broke Japanese codes on a pretty regular basis for quite long periods of time, providing useful information about locations and troop strengths. On the ground, scouts like V-Force and SOE and Force 136, that was the Americans' predecessor to the OSS, managed to gather for Slim an overall intelligence picture which was pretty good. He never had a perfect view of Japanese intentions and actions, but he did know, for example, that the Japanese had been pulling units in from the Pacific, Java, Siam and China for a while, and accurately estimated that the number of Japanese troops in Burma on his front had doubled in the previous 6 months. He therefore warned his units in the Arakan, and all along the front, that they should expect some kind of Japanese counterattack in the near future. Lastly, Slim saw to it that the army adopted a thing he called air-mindedness. With the aid of Bill Old's USAAF Troop Transport Command and Air Marshal Sir John Baldwin's RAF 3rd Tactical Air Force, or 3TAF, along with his own superb Chief of Staff, Alf Snelling, Duke forces were able to adopt and integrate air power into their thinking at all levels, both logistically and defensively. Forewarned of a probable counterattack, Alf Snelling laid out at airfields close to the front all the necessary supplies to keep a division in the field for a protracted period, ready to be loaded and dropped over the battlefields. This was an extension of the work that Snelling was already doing with Troop Transport Command to support 81st West Africans down the Caladan Valley, and indeed what he was about to try and do with Operation Thursday for the Chindis. Slim and his commanders had banged home the point to their troops that holding ground was vital, that the Japanese carried very little in the way of rations, and that if they stuck where they were, they would win, and everything they needed, from rum to razor blades, would be dropped to them by air. It also meant that Slim saw air power as a means to move the battlefield around swiftly, shifting his momentum across hundreds of miles of front fast. Specific brigades within each division were designated as air transportable, meaning that they could be rushed into contact fast, carried there by the RAF and United States Army Air Forces C-46 and 47s. And of course, air-mindedness wasn't just logistical, it was offensive too. Slim understood that he needed modern fighter cover in the right places and fast. Since October of the previous year, 3 squadrons of Spitfire Mark 5s and Mark 8s had appeared on the front, and along with a further 180 other fighters of different types, they'd begun to turn the tide against the Japanese and cut their air force to ribbons. In fact, they destroyed about 70 machines since New Year's alone. On top of this, Hurricanes converted to carry bombs known as Hurry Bombers, and Vengeance dive bombers were deployed in large numbers by 3TAF to smash up stuff on the ground, especially Japanese troop concentrations, artillery points, rivercraft and supply columns. So much so that Hargo was delayed by an entire month for lack of transport and supplies and the ability to concentrate. Absolutely none of these change factors were taken into consideration at any level by Sakurai, Mutaguchi or Kawabe. They relied, as they had always done, on the spirit of Japanese troops to somehow magically overcome the changed tactics of Duke forces. When things failed, they had no plan B, as we will now see. The first time the Indian 7th Division knew that it was in a fight was at 05:30 on the 4th of February 1944, when some strong enemy columns were reported 6 miles behind their front lines. Unsure if this was a probe or a serious attack, Frank Messervy, commander of 7th Division, ordered that his 89th Brigade move through the rest of the division towards the village of Ingyong. By 4 p.m. that day it had become clear that 89th were engaging a much superior force of enemy, but exactly how many still wasn't obvious. But reports started to come in that some 1,000 enemy troops had been seen moving through the village of Tong Bazaar, and more were moving around the area. In point of fact, Tanahashi force now had more than 4,000 troops in the area, having spent the previous 2 days successfully infiltrating around Messervy's right flank of 114th Brigade. In jungle this thick, with slopes all around, such movement was masked and was an absolute gift to the attacking force. But it also could go wrong. Tanahashi's vital supply column of mules and handlers was ambushed suddenly by 114th Brigade and destroyed on that first morning. It became obvious to the British, as they cleared up the aftermath, that this was the massive Japanese counterattack that Messervy had been expecting. In 1942 or 43, the idea of strong enemy forces behind them would have caused the British and Indian troops to break and run, but not so in 1944. On the morning of the 7th of February, it was clear that the 7th Division was surrounded, which came as something of a shock, to put it mildly. The British had assumed that they would at least get a few days' warning, but this had come out of the blue. Nonetheless, there was no panic. Mesavie alerted both Major General Harold Briggs of 5th Division on the other side of the Mayu Range and Christensen back at 15th Corps headquarters that he would stand and fight, putting his key brigades, 89th and 114th, into defensive boxes, along with their motor pools assembled at the administrative area, and ordered outlying forces to make their way back to their nearest box to help with defence. As he did so, all hell broke loose around his own divisional HQ as the Japanese launched a surprise attack aimed at decapitating the division. The last anyone heard from Frank Mesavie's headquarters was his voice over the radio net telling someone to put a pick through that set and let's get going. The working assumption was that he and his staff had all been killed. Christensen immediately ordered somebody from 5th Division to get into the administrative area PD damned Q and make sure that they had a grip on the division. Back at his new army HQ in Camilla, Slim had also been taken by surprise by the scale of the unfolding attack and the loss of Mesavie so early in the battle, but worked fast to respond, calling 2 divisions that he had on standby for just such a situation, 26th in Chittagong and 36th in Calcutta, to move. 26th Division was commanded by Major General Cyril Lomax, a man that Slim knew that he could rely on to keep a cool head, and crucially, to work in conjunction with Christensen rather than worrying too much about who should be in charge later. Lomax, as we mentioned earlier, had done exactly this for Slim in the Arakan the previous year. Slim was not disappointed. Lomax immediately flew his divisional HQ into Bali Bazaar to co-locate with Christensen's, and within hours was up and running, but everybody knew that it would take days to get the bulk of the division into the contact area. As they filtered out, so 36th Division filtered in behind them to take their place as a floating reserve. Meanwhile, Slim gave the much-anticipated order for 7th Division to be maintained by air. With Operation Thursday literally about to start, and with 81st still needing support, this was no mean feat, and it stretched Bill Auld's troop carrier command almost to breaking point. But with the help of a hell of a lot of volunteers from across the front, working around the clock, they swung into action. The administrative area was not, as the name suggests, set up for anything other than administration. In a square about 3/4 of a mile on each side, it contained a few anti-aircraft guns, the divisional transport pool, main dressing station or MDS, an ammo dump, a stores dump, some V-Force scouts, and assorted rear echelon staff. On the news of Mesavie's disappearance, it also contained one Brigadier Evans from 5th Division, who made an incredibly dangerous and rapid transit over the Nyokidok or the Okidok Pass to take command. He didn't know his troops and they didn't know him, but there really wasn't a lot of time to worry about such niceties, with 10,000 angry servants of the Emperor knocking around the area just itching to find someone to war crime. The only veteran fighting formations in the box were 3 companies of the West Yorkshires, resting after their efforts against the Golden Fortress and commanded by a chap called Lieutenant Colonel Munchie Cree. If nothing else, he wins the best name in this story competition. I'm trying to get away from putting too many black and white photos of chaps in uniform in front of you, as I know it gets bloody confusing, so I won't really mention Munchie again, but just know that he was in command of the West Yorks in the box. He fought like a fucking tiger throughout, and he's an utter legend in my book. Fortunately, after all this, he was given some time to rest and recuperate in a small hill town called Imphal. Aside from the West Yorks, there were also a few walking wounded, as well as some forlorn artillerymen who didn't actually have any guns, but did at least know how to dig foxholes. Otherwise, it was cooks, doctors, nurses, drivers, mule handlers, and assorted other rear echelon types who began to frantically dig themselves in. It was time to see whether or not those battle school lessons had worked. Okay, look, I'm going to level with you at this point. I didn't draw this map. A lovely man called Jim Holland, fantastic historian, drew it and put it on his Twitter account, and I'm totally stealing it here. Let me offer him recompense by saying that his book, Burma 44, is the definitive account of this battle and well worth a read. You should totally go and get it. As you can see, there are a number of high points here labelled as hills. These overlooked the box and offered whoever was on the top the ability to see everything down below. And that meant that if Evans didn't control them, the Japanese could call down fire directly onto his positions, which would probably be fatal for all concerned. In the Western Desert, the idea of defensive boxes had proved to be deeply flawed because the ground was flat, manoeuvre was easy, and German guns could be brought to bear basically on everything because they were all observable targets. Rommel, as a good German general, had of course concentrated his forces, his armour and his firepower to create a local Schwerpunkt, that is, point of focus, and destroyed each in turn. It was the old concentration of force rule in action. But in the hills and jungles surrounding Shinswaya, it was a very different story. Evans knew that actually all he needed to do was to try and control the high points on his immediate front. The foliage on the hills further back precluded observation. But it also meant that the enemy could shift their attack to almost anywhere on the front unobserved by using that same jungle. What Evans needed, and urgently, was more firepower to try and control those hills, and at 2:30 that day he got exactly what he wished for, in the form of 25th Dragoons rolling into his box. And they brought with them an armoured car which contained a very much alive Frank Messervy, reputedly minus his hat. Having recovered himself a bit, Messervy was briefed by Evans, and impressed, Messervy turned around and said, "You get on with this fight, Jeff, I'll get on with planning the next one." And then got onto the radio net saying, "This is General Frank Messervy here. I'm back in command and here are my orders. We will fight them where we stand and we will beat them. After that we will resume our attack on Butidang." From then on, Evans ran the fight in the box and Messervy organised the division as a whole. Evans pulled together the 25th Dragoons and the West Yorks into a mobile firefighting force that could attack enemy positions by day and at night move into the centre of the box, where their combined guns could be directed almost 360 degrees as needed to destroy enemy night attacks, and the heavy machine guns that were mounted on the M3s could be dismounted and put on fixed lines of fire. To make sure that this worked properly, Brigadier Evans figured that he would need to be in close contact with Major Hugh Ley, CO of the 25th. He therefore jumped into Ley's trench. And what happened next brings a tear to Jenkins's eye whenever I tell the story. Ley's batman, a former gentleman's gentleman and mere corporal, looked the brigadier in the eye and in a clear voice told him that he was, of course, welcome in the Major's trench, but that the brigadier should not forget that he was a guest and should comport himself accordingly. Formalities completed and social order established, even as shells rained down on the box, the batman then asked the brigadier how he took his tea. Quite what Evans's response was is unrecorded. Within hours, the Japanese had cut the Gnocchi Dog Pass in multiple places, but were struggling to concentrate themselves. Infiltration movement through the jungles was always likely to see units getting strung out, and the sensible thing to do was to wait for the tail to catch up and then attack in force, but that wouldn't be very Bushido, would it now? And the enemy's right there, and you've got this sword in your hand, so I guess banzai or some shit? Tanahashi couldn't help himself and did what all Japanese commanders did pretty much on every front throughout the war, and launched an immediate attack with the troops that were at hand. The attack fell against a sector held by a company of muleteers, that is, mule handlers. In 1942, these troops would have easily been brushed aside, but Slim's training came to the fore. These troops, who were never expected to actually have to fight, knew their drills, knew how to sustain defensive fire, and knew how to coordinate with the units on either side of them to defend against the attack. And somewhat to the surprise of the Japanese, it threw them back into the jungle and killed many of them in the process. This set the pattern for the coming days, savage night attacks involving horrific hand-to-hand fighting that ebbed and flowed across key positions. To avoid blue-on-blue situations, all men were ordered to stay in their trenches no matter what by night. Anything moving was to be considered hostile and to be engaged immediately. This had tragic and horrific consequences when, a few days later, the Japanese managed to overrun the main dressing station. For 2 hours, men in their foxholes could hear the screams of their wounded comrades as they were found and killed with bayonets, and the orderlies were interrogated and shot. Over the next 2 days, bitter fighting ensued and drove the Japanese back. 31 Allied dead were found in the MDS. A number of Indian orderlies were reported as missing, presumed captured. They subsequently turned up, all dead, having been bound, blindfolded and used as human shields, and the survivors beaten and shot or bayoneted to death. In all, just 3 men escaped the carnage of the MDS. The one thing that the admin box did have was plenty of supplies. It's why Sakurai Force was concentrating its efforts on the administrative area, because it had in fact been feeding the entire division previously, and the Japanese plan relied on capturing the so-called Churchill rations within. This presented Bill Olds with the challenge of trying to resupply the rest of the division, scattered across the countryside, a countryside now swarming with Japanese anti-aircraft and machine guns. On the 8th of February, an attempt by the Troop Carrier Command to drop supplies from C-47s saw a Dakota shot down by enemy fighters and a scattering of the rest of the formation. Realising that his supplies were crucial, he worked with the RAF to set up a joint operation on the 9th to make drops on the 89th Brigade's Braganza box. Over 300 sorties were flown by RAF Spitfires as escorts, and Olds himself flew the lead C-47. By the end of the day, he had personally dropped over £7,500 of supplies and picked up quite a few snazzy-looking new ventilation holes in his aircraft. But point made, Troop Carrier Command and 3TAF made dozens of successful drops over the coming days and wiped the Japanese Air Force from the sky. Meanwhile, fighting in and around the admin box had begun to get something of a routine. harassing sniping fire with occasional mortaring and shelling by day, followed by concentrated Japanese night attacks. As one veteran commented, "Our hearts sank with the setting of the sun and rose with the dawn." For the next few weeks, British and Indian troops within the admin box and other scattered defensive positions east of the Mayu Range would only be able to grab sleep intermittently, a few minutes at a time, maybe 2 or 3 hours in every 24. Men were posted 2 in each position, each kicking the other to ensure that they didn't fall asleep. Many took to taking watch with their bayonets fixed, leaning their chins on the points to stay awake. Even in heavy combat, fatigue was such that, when not directly being engaged, exhaustion would roll in waves, turning legs and stomachs to jelly, and even basic tasks took monumental willpower. For most troops in the admin box, this was their first taste of actual combat. But with each attack that they fought off, confidence grew, and the men began to realise that they could win. Moreover, Messervy had a stroke of luck in the form of a captured Japanese map of the Hargo offensive, showing Sakurai's force dispositions and revealing his truly shitty supply situation. Now, we've talked about concentration of force a couple of times during this video, and we've talked about it as a key principle of warfare, which you should always stick to. But as with all rules, sometimes you need to know when you've got to break it. Knowing now that Sakurai simply had to take the admin box before his supplies ran out, Messervy took a bit of a gamble. He started to push squadrons of the 25th Dragoons out of the admin box and into the other boxes around the area. This then allowed those brigades, like the 89th Brigade, to patrol more strongly out of their positions. Suddenly the Japanese would face a choice. They could turn and face this new threat, allowing Evans to attack them from behind, or they could focus on the admin box and know that the other brigades would attack them from behind that way. Suddenly it was the Japanese who were trapped in here with the British, not the other way around. Things visibly began to turn when, several days into the siege, the Japanese began to dig in. It was a sign that their offensive power had been spent and that they were struggling badly. By the 12th, the defenders within the admin box could hear 1st Lincolns, the vanguard of 26th Division, fighting off to their front, further reinforcing the belief within the box that they could win. There is a phase, often repeated by pub wankers and folks who saw Journey's End once on stage, that Duke troops in World War I were lions led by donkeys. It's utter bollocks, but it could be applied much more sensibly to the Japanese army in the last 2 years of World War II. Time after time, Japanese commanders, out of ideas or options, would choose to send their troops on suicidal and ineffectual frontal assaults rather than retreating or surrendering. Or he would order them to hold ground that had no strategic or tactical value, only to be destroyed piecemeal by opposing forces. The men of the Japanese army were capable of surviving conditions that would have destroyed almost anyone else in uniform, of moving vast distances on minimal supplies and showing courage almost unparalleled in history, but they were wasted by stupid and inept leaders who did not deserve to lead them. On the 14th of February, General Sakurai offered one such example, signalling to all of his forces in the area, "Tanahashi butai have completely surrounded the enemy. However, the enemy are still continuing their hysterical resistance. I am going to make great demands of you in the struggle against this already doomed enemy." And to prove just how doomed the enemy in fact was, he then ordered, "General attack begins 14th February 1900 hours. The general attack was, in fact, the second time a general attack had been ordered in an operation that was, in fact, a general attack. How imaginative. The real flaw that the Japanese troops always suffered from is that they obeyed these sorts of stupid orders without question at multiple levels, and this was true in the admin box as it was elsewhere. For one example, a company of 120 men ordered to attack the British up a dried-up riverbed known as a nullah did so time after time, long after it became apparent that the British had overwhelming firepower dug in and their sights zeroed on the exit for the nullah. 115 of 120 of the company were killed over 3 days in 7 attacks, for no purpose whatsoever. C Squadron 25th Dragoons made contact with 1st Lincoln's forward elements on the 16th of February 1944. The siege of the admin box was not over, but the British and Indian forces were in touch with one another, and for the Japanese it was now just a matter of time. Tanahashi and Kobo forces had fought and died for 12 days. The Allied forces had not broken and run. They had no supplies left. All that was left of them was to dig in and try and force the Duke forces to dig them out, which they duly began to do, using M3 tanks to pump shells into their bunkers as the infantry clawed close enough to hurl grenades through openings or use flamethrowers or phosphorus grenades or Molotov cocktails or knives and kukris to get them out. One of the first men to walk out of the admin box was Anthony Irwin, son of Noel Irwin and a very different character from his idiot father. During the siege, he and a group of V-Force scouts had been given a hill to protect, which became known as Irwin's Hill, but now as the siege wound down, he was once more tasked with scouting ahead. He was ordered by Frank Messervy to go and make contact with the 89th Brigade in the Braganza Box, effectively being charged as the canary in the coal mine, who, if he found gas, or more accurately in this case Japanese, would be promptly killed. Irwin did as he was ordered, and after a hair-raising march, he actually ambled into 89th's positions on foot, much to their surprise, on the 18th of February. Over subsequent days, although there was occasional shelling, the admin box remained mostly untroubled, and 7th Division moved, along with all of the other formations, back to the offensive, clearing pockets of resistance, expanding their patrol ranges, and beginning to dominate the surrounding countryside, just as Slim had taught them to. Occasionally, lone or small groups of Japanese soldiers would be shot, trying to find food in British supply areas despite the risk. On the 22nd, an entire Japanese battalion, the 2nd Battalion 122nd Regiment, attacked the admin box once more in what proved to be the final assault. On paper, this formation had 900 men. In reality, there were just 3 officers and 73 men able to take part. Predictably, they were wiped out, perhaps just 20 escaped with their lives, having inflicted 3 killed and 2 wounded on the British. The siege was over. Elements of Tanahashi and Kobo force, starving, diseased and scared, attempted to escape the area, but they were mown down, killed in their hundreds. Sakurai force ceased to exist. During the battle, Japanese losses exceeded 7,000 dead, with an unknown number of wounded. By contrast, 15th Corps had suffered less than half that many casualties, many of whom were wounded and would in time return to duty. It was the first decisive Duke victory against the Japanese in Southeast Asia, but it would not be the last. It should have been an ominous warning to anyone in the Japanese High Command with the eyes to see it, but in Myanmar, in the pleasant hill village in Burma that was 15th Army's headquarters, Mutaguchi did not wish to see. He didn't see the destruction of Sakurai's force, nor the damage done to 28th Army, much less the graves of the men that he'd thrown away, nor the dangerous strength of the British. He saw British reserves being moved to the south, just as he'd planned. He saw glory in the hills of Imphal and the glittering prize of India almost within his grasp. Now was the moment to strike. Well, thank you for getting to the end of this. I really appreciate that you've taken the time to watch it and get all the way through it. We have at fucking last managed to cover a British military victory. Go us! This has been, as I always say, a bit of a labour of love, but in this particular case it really has been. I think I've recorded this now, well, I know I've recorded this now 4 times. I've rewritten it multiple times. And exactly how we go about tackling the rest of the story, I'm still contemplating. I have some ideas and I'll bring those to fruition over the next few days. As I record this, my plan is to go slightly back in time, examine the British and Japanese approaches to mutual invasion, and then look at Kohima specifically, and then the aftermath of that fight and how it kind of took us through to about November of 1944, where the British were and what they were up to. It's interesting, it's fascinating. I've got about 3 hours of content written, but it needs a lot of editing, so bear with me. In the meantime, if you've enjoyed this episode, please do let me know if you have any questions or comments. Just drop them down below. I'll be happy to reply. If I found anything that I've got wrong, and Lord knows I'm an amateur historian, there's always a chance that inconsistencies or inaccuracies have got in there. I'll put a comment at the top called something like snagging so that you can see it. If you'd like to and you've enjoyed this, please feel free to hit the like and subscribe buttons. I really appreciate it. If you want to watch me in real time having little mini breakdowns, then by all means do become one of my Patreons. Not only is it guaranteed to make you more sexually attractive and look good in literally any clothes at all, it also means that just for $6 a month you get early access to new videos and my super secret Discord where you can see me screaming into the void in real time. It's a bargain. And did I also mention that it would end world hunger and prevent nuclear war? Because sure, why not? It does those things too. Anyway, until next time, I wish you a very pleasant day, my lords, my ladies, and everything in between. Adieu.